Hello, welcome to Edinburgh JS. We are live streaming on YouTube, and this is our first in-person meetup in quite a few years now. So welcome, thanks for coming along. I'm Jamie, I'm one of the co-hosts, and tonight you'll be hearing from me on prototyping with Next.js and with Airtable, and you'll be hearing from Esteban on AngularJS. So we've actually merged the Angular and Edinburgh JS meetups, so hopefully we'll be hearing more from the community there as well. I'd like to start by thanking the Bayes Centre for hosting us, the Scottish Government for giving us some money to try and get started again for their ecosystem fund, and Alan from Product Forge for live streaming. So thank you very much to each and all of those. I want to start by also promoting our next event, which is in exactly a month's time on the 17th of March. So if you're available then, get that in your calendar and look out at meetup.com and Twitter, because we'll be announcing things there. We've got a couple of talks lined up, and if you want to do a talk, please do let me know. Send us a DM on Twitter. So tonight I will be chatting about prototyping with Next.js and Airtable. I am a freelance consultant and developer, so I spend a lot of time working with people who've got some sort of business idea. Maybe they know a little bit about technology, maybe they know absolutely nothing about technology, but can see a business opportunity. So I find myself a lot of time working with people with different backgrounds, coming to me saying, you know, here's a design that I've done, and this is a way that I started using recently in order to prototype to try and get to the idea. So I've made a little code sandbox, which will link there, and I'll publish these slides on my GitHub later this evening. So people usually turn up with a couple, maybe one or two of these things. Usually it's an opportunity. They say, hey, I've got this business idea. I have previously run a business and I want to digitize it, or wouldn't it be great if? And they maybe bring that, and they sometimes bring some of the other things. Maybe they've got the UX or UI worked out where they have drawn a picture, or maybe got a designer to lay out some screens like, hey, can you make this? Now, I find with a lot of that, there are some issues that, ideas don't always translate well into making, say, a web app or a mobile app. So you tend to go through a stage of trying to figure out the idea. So figuring out, has their idea for solving the problem or dealing with the opportunity, can you actually make that in practice, and does it work? So, can you get customers? Can you market it? People might have, some sort of source of data or some input into their business, which they haven't quite figured out yet. So often they say, oh, we'll get a list of this and we'll show it to people, but they haven't actually made the list yet. So often I start by saying, well, have you made a spreadsheet of it? Because that is quite often a way that people are familiar with. So using technology of Next.js and Airtable is a good way to help non-technical people iterate on a data model, maybe the back-end flow of how things work and how they shift data around in the business, and then see the results displayed in real time on a website that they can then use or maybe prototype or demo to customers. Now, this can actually be fully featured. It might be something they actually roll out into production, or it can be enough to raise some money or take it to maybe one or two initial customers and say, does this actually solve your problem? So the point with this is really to save time and try and ensure that you're building the right thing. So what I'm going to do is take you on a quick tour of a little website that I've made, a reading list. So during the pandemic, I joined a book club. So this was the easiest data that I had to hand, which a list of books, a list of authors, and then show you some of the things that Next.js and Airtable allow us to do, and we can think of how that might apply to some of the prototype sites. So I'll show you how we're setting up Next.js, how we're setting up Airtable. We'll build a list page, which lists the books. We'll build a detail page, which shows you the book details. We'll build a feature view. So this is a view into the spreadsheet that is different from the two sort of master list and detail pages. I'll show you how to load data client-side in an easy way for more real-time data, and then show you the whole website. So just as a little preview, you'll get this list of books. You'll be able to click on the list of books, get the detail page. You'll be able to get an author page that lists the books, and then a feature page which gets a custom list of books that you defined in Airtable. So this is basically all served up off an Airtable backend. So what is Next.js? I don't know how familiar people are with Next.js, but it's a React-based framework. So it does a lot of things by convention. It uses file system routing, dynamic groups. So basically, you've got a pages folder, and in that folder, if you make a file, it will then become a page. And you return from the default export some React code. So it's very simple. So you can see here, we've got my page just returns, a hello world div, and that will be returned to the client. So it's very simple to get up and running and produce pages. So if you've got, say, some content that people want, copy and paste it in, for the first few things like that. So very easy to get up and running. It kind of reminds me of old PHP things where you just, get some files in a server and it will render them to the client. So the interesting thing is getting the data onto the website. So there's a few places in Next.js in which you can load data from a backend somewhere. So that is during the build. So you're making the website and you're deploying new code, you already have all your data, and you load it at build time. So all the processing happens during that build step. You can also load it during the request. So someone requests a page from you in their browser, the server receives that, loads some data, and then sends it down to the client. So during the build, during the request, or on the front end. So your pages essentially are skeletons. You provide some information to the front end saying, here's the ID of the page or whatever, and then that uses it to hit an API and load some data. So those are the 3 times that you can do that, and each of them has some benefits. So, for example, if you're loading data during the build, then it can be super fast for a client when they get it, because they're essentially loading a static page, and that can be delivered via content delivery network that's close to where the person is loading it. During the request is a usual sort of server transaction, and on the front end, maybe they get a skeleton loading page and then load the data in progressively. So it might feel quite fast to them, even though it's a couple of trips to the server. So build time data loading. This doesn't matter where you're getting it from, but in the page, as well as the default export, which is the React code, you create a function that called getStaticProps. So this basically says that static is, at build time, we're going to produce something, and then it will become statically handed over to the page. So you can see here in the little code sample that I've got my page, it takes a prop called name, and then I say hello name. And here I've just done some dummy code which says, my name's Jamie, so I'm doing that. But before that, you could fetch some data, you could fetch it from multiple APIs, combine that, process that, and then hand it over to your page. You can do request time data loading in almost the same way. If you export a function called getServerSideProps, then rather than it being compiled at build time, when the server gets that request, it will hand those props over to the page. So that means that the data is essentially fresh for that request. And then client-side data loading, in the same way that you'd do any kind of client-side data loading in a React application, you can just fire off a fetch in a function and then set that in state, and that will be kind of consumed in the page. So this, I guess, does assume that you're somewhat familiar with React, but yeah. So Airtable, why would you use Airtable? Well, it is essentially an online spreadsheet. And the benefits of Airtable are that it comes with a bunch of integrations. So you can integrate different tools such as Zapier or any other no-code tools and essentially send it through to Airtable. There's also an API so that you as a programmer can add your own scripts, run your own servers, and sends data through to Airtable as well. So when you're building out the idea of a business, often you want to juggle data between different sources. So Airtable can be good for that. So the first step is to create a base in Airtable. So a base is much like a spreadsheet file. So here you can see in Airtable, I've created a base with two tables, a books table, which has title, author, tags and notes. The author's table is literally just their name, and I've created a relation between the two. So I've said that here's a field, I'm relating it to the record. For the author record, it's limited to one author per book. And the other interesting thing here is I've pulled through name from author. So you can say for linked records, I want to pull through these fields. So the reason that we want to do that initially is that rather than doing a join in our code, this is essentially a join on the spreadsheet. So these fields, when we query this base, will be returned for us. So this is a very simple setup. And you can see that if you've got someone who's non-technical, if they know roughly about spreadsheets, then they'll be able to use this. So we set that up. We add the fields and relations. We've added the join fields to join the author onto the book records. So then we want to connect the Airtable up to Next.js. So it's simple. There's a package that you can install. You get your API key and base ID via the Airtable API documentation. Live in the documentation, they will show you your actual base. So the documentation is essentially interactive for the base that you're looking at. So if I load the documentation, you'll be able to see my API keys, which I don't want. But if you go on to the documentation there, it should actually have examples of how to query and the information that you need. So you put these details in your environment. Next.js, if you have a .env file, then it will use that locally to populate the variables. If you've got stuff on the back end, you just use regular environment things. If you ever want to pass environment variables down to the front end, you need to preface them with next public. But for this, we won't. Then I think the next step that you'll want to do is to write some utility functions. So a utility function is essentially something that will take what Airtable is giving us and then wrap it in something like get books or get book, get author, in order that we can then use it in our queries. Now, this will help us, one, serialize the response we get from Airtable, so pick some fields out, because the response you get doesn't serialize, so you will just want to create a little object. But in terms of iterating to build a product, it does mean that you can just switch this one utility function. Say at some point you switch to a different thing from Airtable, like a special server or database, you just patch out that utility function and that will then go through your code base. So it helps you, splitting up initially helps you then iterate at a later time. So the utility functions, I usually start with these two. These are in some examples that you can find online. It's really easy that you want something that minifies the record or essentially picks from the record. So you can get the record ID and then just transfer the fields across. If you want to pick certain things out of the fields, for example, the name or so on, you can build the object there, minify record, and then minify records just takes the array that Airtable sends back to you and applies that to each record. So that's the first thing that we want to do, and that will be pretty much at the top of all of your utility functions. So we're going to write two functions. So you can see here we've made a new Airtable, we've given it the environment variables so that we can access it, and then we specify which table we want to query. So our table is the books table. We can then write two functions, and the package is incredibly easy to use. We can just select everything from the books table to get all the books, or we can find the ID on the table, and that gets us an individual book. So there is a query language, query filters that I will get to later, but these are the most basic things. So this will help us for our list page and our detail page. So the home page, we want to get server-side props, and we just await the books. Notice an async function. So we await the books, and then we return the books in the props. So on the actual home page, we'll be able to see the index page. We're querying, it's returning the books prop. We're handing that books prop to the index page, and then I've just made a simple React component to list the books in order, which if we look in here, is literally just an unordered list. So it's as simple as that. You can hand over stuff. You could do any front-end filtering. Here you could display this in a certain way. You could make it pretty. Airtable does have an attachments field that you can use images in, and it provides different sizes of thumbnails. So there's like a small, medium, and original. So you can actually you can freshen things up and do quite a nice design with images and other attachments if you want to. So making a detail page, it's as simple as that. So here we've got a list of books. Maybe you want like a menu for a restaurant site, where they can, list things or whatever. It's the same principle. You just query that table and hand it over through props. So that is our list page, and now we want to do a book detail page. Now, what I'm going to show you here, so the home page, we've done get server-side props. So every time that list page is generated, it goes and queries, so the list is always fresh. But we can also make an assumption that once you've got the book details aren't going to change. So you might be able to say that in advance, that maybe the number of records you've got is going to change, but actually once you've got a record, it's reasonably static. So that may or may not be true for whatever project you're building. So we can generate in advance at build time using get static props. So when the static props is called, it's called at build time. So we're going to make a page in pages /books square brackets ID. That ID is something that Next.js will then hand over to our get static props as part of the parameters. So you can see here it hands us a context. We do context params ID, and that variable is then handed to our code. So we just await our utility function, get book. If you remember, get book just awaits the table find ID. So that's the book that we're going to get back, and then we return that. Now, the cool thing here is there's two cool things that Next.js does. Is firstly, you can give it a list of static paths. So if we know the paths in advance, we can say, get me all the list of books and generate these paths. But then we can also say the fallback is blocking. So if it finds an ID that we haven't pre-generated, then it will then hand that over to the function as well. So I can probably live code this. The other thing is revalidation. So you've got something that is kind of static, but not quite. You can also regenerate that page incrementally. You could be like, make sure this is updated once a day or once an hour or once every minute, depending on the traffic of your site. So if that revalidate prop isn't in there, then the page is just generated statically and then remains. If the path doesn't exist, then the page will be generated and it will essentially end up in the cache for as long as it's revalidated for. So in here you can see books folder, we've got the ID, and then get static props. So in here, if I wanted to generate some paths in advance, I could do const books path, and then this is live coding, await the get books, and then do something like books paths.map. Then you would return from each of those an object which would have params, and then you want ID would be the book ID. So if that makes sense for people, I would import that up top. So you then just return the const paths, and then use that. So this would then generate the paths, and then each object in the paths array has the params ID, and then each ID is then handed over to this get static props thing. So that way, if you ended up with an Airtable with 10,000 records, you could pick the top 1,000 records somehow by writing a query for them, and then pre-generate those pages in build time. So maybe it's a tension between the building stuff in advance to make it fast for people to load, versus your build time, maybe going higher. So it depends on what you want. But typically, you might want to generate all the pages in advance, but you don't have to. I can refresh the browser to refresh this container. Hopefully it'll work. So yeah, so hopefully that will reboot. So that's basically the detail page, and yet again, it's just a little detail component that displays that. So once you've got the detail page, yeah, in fact that's the books path. we've got now a site that has a list from Airtable and then has a detail page for each of those things. And remember, you can mix and match this data. So if you had some other API and Airtable was returning something, you could then do a second query. You await the Airtable stuff, then you could await something else. So you could be like, what was the weather on the day that I read this, if you had a date or something like that, and live query that. So prototypes, the reason that we're doing this, remember, is for figuring out the data model. So an example that I'm going to use here is, let's have featured books. So I want to show people the books that I especially love. But maybe later on down the line, I might actually, it's not the books, it's the plays that I want to show. And typically people would go and you tweak it in code. Whereas actually what we want to do is allow people to tweak it in Airtable. So the way that we can do this is by using a view. So here in Airtable, I've made view featured, and I can filter by tag. So there's basically, Airtable allows you to filter from the main view whatever you want. So I've just said, get me all the things where the tags are any of plays, or whatever else. So I can build complex conditions here that then create this featured view. And that can change, and my code doesn't need to know about this. So for example, here I could have a rating or progress and say, actually, no, I only want to include 5-star things. So if something's 5-star, even if it's tagged with my favorite, it won't get in. So a non-technical person could mess around with this and change the criteria without it being an issue. So Airtable in the library provides a really easy way of doing that. You just select and you specify the view name. So I've just made it view. I've got a little helper function, get books by view. So that means this helper function, if I wanted to make a page like /plays, I just dump that in with plays at the end. If I wanted to make a favorite books, I do view favorite in Airtable, and I could then just use this utility function to quickly query those. So yeah, again, you just select the view, and then those appear on the website. Sandbox is doing its thing. I'll see if I can reboot this if it's working. Yeah, so you can see featured books. I've just got featured in pages, exports plays page, and you can see there it is just those plays taken out. So if I want to do filter by tags, if I do it has any of, also politics books, you can see a couple more there. So that should, if I refresh it, then include the politics books as well. So you can see it'd be really easy for someone to adjust and then appear essentially in real time on the site. So that's if you had get server-side props, not get static props. But yeah, it's up to you to figure out what the best is for that. When you're developing, static is actually live as well. But when you're going to production, it's actually static. So that is a view. So using a view means you can change your idea to something else quickly. Now, a note about linked data, because this can trip you up. So the authors pages, you see here, I go to a book page, say Reflections of Revolution, and I've got an author page, and I want to query on the author page for books by the author. I'll choose an author with more than one book. Homer has got 2 books. Now, the difficulty with Airtable is that it doesn't actually have a search by ID. So in our Airtable, the unique key field is the title field for books and the name for author. But under the hood, it also uses an ID. And the ID is what you're getting in the query, but for search, it can be a bit difficult to actually search using the query for that. So what you need to do is you need to do search by name, and in there, what I've done in the authors file, you'll be able to see I've added, in the utilities function at the bottom, I've added a filter by formula where you do search, you can plug in the name and you find the field. So I'm searching on the books table and I'm filtering by formula that the author has the name, because the name is the essentially user-facing unique field, not the underhood unique field. if that makes sense to people. So that can actually be a bit annoying when you're first doing it. But if you find filter by formula and then you just run the search rather than trying to find it by ID, that is what you need. Fresh data. So we've got build time data for the detail pages. We've got server-side request data for the index page, and then we want some fresh data. So we want some reading progress. So in the books table, I've got a progress field, and I can list how much progress I've made on each book. So I've said 100% for one, 50% for the other. And this is just a client-side fetch. So Next.js allows you to quickly make an API in the same way with file system routing. So I can make in API/progress/ID, I make a file and I export a handler. That handler takes the request and then gives a response, and it's got some nice helpers for, it loads the request body, and it's got some helpers for sending JSON back down to the client. I can use the same utility function to live get a book from Airtable and respond with the progress. So here all I'm saying is get the query from the ID from the query, get the book using my utility function, and then send that back down a little object there with the progress. Either the book field's progress. If there isn't a progress set, then that won't be defined, so you also want to return 0, just for completeness sake. And then in the front end, you just use a normal use effect when the page loads to query your API progress. And I can't remember if I actually coded this or not live. I don't think I did. So essentially you just put in here, the use effect in here, and load the data on the book detail page, and you could then put that in state or do some other calculation with it. So you can see here in the API, got the progress. It's just doing that thing. So it helps you. You can have, if you're loading from multiple sources and you want essentially real-time data, you could build almost all the data you wanted in your site and then real-time fetch something from your API and incrementally load it in afterwards. So my reading progress on any given book, I could just put that in there. So that is the basics of creating a site. So I've shown you build time, request time, and client-side stuff to make a simple site. In terms of server flow, you can use a bunch of tools. There are many, many integrations that you can connect to Airtable. So maybe you've got webhooks from other services, maybe you've got Google Sheets, maybe they're set up on Slack, maybe you want some sort of calendar integration. There are loads and loads of tools out there that can do that for you, and you can help set up, and someone with very little technical experience can set up. So that is how to quickly prototype with Next.js and Airtable in order to build the right thing. If you have any questions, now would be a good time. Alan is waving a microphone, so I will get that for him. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It was great. Would you like to show the network tab and see how the props are passed from the server to the client? Would you like to show it? I mean, so people can kind of have an idea.
So they won't be on the network tab. So if you're using get static props, it will compile that when you run a build, and it will just spit out HTML with some JavaScript files. So the network tab will show you getting an HTML file and getting a JavaScript file, but essentially will be pre-compiled. So they're getting static HTML that they're loading in the browser. So there's no additional requests to load data going on there. The same goes for get server-side props. You're essentially getting down the wire, React that has been compiled into HTML. And then the application JavaScript comes down and then essentially boots whatever interactivity that you've got on top of that. So there won't be anything for that. For client side, it's exactly the same as any other kind of fetch that you do in a React application. You're fetching, you hit an API, it will send down that response. So it's very lightweight for the client. Particularly if you're doing static generation, you're just essentially serving plain HTML.
Yeah, good.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool.
Thanks.
Does anyone else have any other questions?
Cool. Thanks so much. That was really interesting. I had a question about the Airtable API, whether there's any limits to usage or data size, particularly. I'm thinking of quite large files.
I can't remember off the top of my head. For the prototype projects that I've done, we haven't run into it. There is a pricing thing. I think you're limited to the number of users, and the API actually I think is rate limited as well. It's like a few requests per second. But if you're generating at build time, you're not going to exceed that. So I'd say for early type things where you've got a couple of users and a few thousand records, like I think the point of this for me is to kind of get an idea of the shape of the data and to get real data into the application. So many people have and do build proper full-scale applications in Airtable, and obviously you can pay for it as a paid service. But I think for this, the interesting thing is when you're like, can you go and get me the real data? You've got this idea for an application, actually go and make that list. It sometimes comes back in a slightly different form to what people originally anticipated. So this kind of technique is really useful for that. So although there probably are limitations to Airtable, I think for the level that you'd want to work at, it's probably okay.
I have another question. You know the reasoning behind there being no indexing? Because I was really kind of curious. I use Elastic quite a lot, and it just made me think, why limit yourself to not having proper indexing that can be queried? So for example, with search name. Why?
Yeah, I mean, so again, this is for the kind of very limited side of things. So an example project that I've got, someone comes to me and says, hey, I've got this idea of stuff. This is for the level of the first few weeks of kind of scoping things out. So, if I'm doing something where I'm like, okay, well, I need to write I need to get a database for them. I also then need to think, well, how are they going to put stuff into the database? Because either they need to write it somewhere and I need to import it, or maybe there's a GUI in the database, but that's usually less easy to use and less easy to automate than Airtable. And even for like content management, Airtable does have rich text fields, which are very limited. You can't, it's like bold text or whatever. So there's some things that you can do to help people kind of figure out the shape of what it is that they're doing. Obviously, if you're finding it difficult because you're like, oh, I'm trying to look up this and trying to look up that, and actually I've got 15 different joins down this Airtable, that's the point at which you say, okay, actually we need a different database.
Yeah.
But by that point, you've worked out and you've got the client, the non-technical person, to come to you with some real life data and have maybe gone through a couple of iterations of figuring out what that looks like. So although that's totally valid and it can be a bit annoying, this is really to help you work with them.
Yeah, I totally see that trade-off between the user friendliness and efficiency. And my last question is, what does happen if the person you're working with enters the same offer name or something like that? Like when there are duplicates, what does it do? Does it just
so the constraints are on Airtable, so that's like a
limiting?
Yeah.
Okay.
So like you can in Airtable when you're setting up, fields are like you can have few permissions, but there's also this is the primary key, unique presentation. So that's something that Airtable takes care of. In terms of data integrity. And the other good thing is as well is they can't type in an author that doesn't exist. The essentially some of the work to do with validation of the data is Airtable's problem and not yours.
I really like
so
that.
it's not like you're dealing with a database and I need to remember to check, and if they delete an author, what happens? Airtable will deal with it.
It kind of feels like it's partly managing your relationship with your client in a sense.
Yeah.
That you don't need to deal with. So I really like that, offloading that.
Because a lot of the time, like what you're trying to do is kind of open the conversation about data models. I think anyone who's freelanced and done work for people with new ideas finds that maybe people don't appreciate. 95% of the data is like this, and you kind of want the example of the 5%, and you want to start having the conversations about how it is that they're modeling their business, where the data comes from, how do they get it, what kind of state does it come in, how do they process it, what fields are there, you could have some fields that in the design that they've provided you they provide a short space, but you find out actually book titles might be really long for, maybe it's like academic papers, so actually maybe the design needs to change. So having these conversations early and kind of getting that data flow kind of helps you start build the right thing.
That's really cool. I'm convinced. Thanks.
Cool.
Anyone else?
Anyone else? Cool. So on that note, we will take a short break for, should we say 10 minutes? So we'll be back on YouTube in 10 minutes. Please do stay tuned for Esteban's talk on AngularJS. Thank you. Hello, and welcome back to Edinburgh JS, live from the Bay Centre. Just before we get on with the next talk, just a reminder, 17th of next month, we're here in person at the Bay Centre with a few talks lined up, so please do mark that in your calendars. Remember to join the meetup group and RSVP, as we'll have a guest list for that. You can also find us on Twitter at EdinburghJS for all news and information. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Esteban, who is going to talk about Angular.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. I'm Esteban, a front-end developer. My colleague is James. We work together at DC Thompson. So yeah, I've joined that role recently. Today's talk is about Angular. It's a framework. You will hear a lot of controversy and the fight, which is better, React or Angular. So if you're fed up of that, well, you hear it one more time. But I'm not going to put them side by side and do that stuff. You know, I'm going to do some comparison, and you will see some similarities as well. So it's a nice logo. I like the logo. That's what I like the most. I use this framework for a couple of projects. I don't use it currently because of I've transitioned to other technologies, but I still like it. I will still pick it for a project if it suits the project needs. So yeah, I need to ask you, how many of you have coded in Angular? If you raise your hand, one, no? Well, it's exciting because it's a whole new world for you. So yeah, how many of you have coded in React? Okay, we have more hands. And any other front-end frameworks? Any of you? No? No? Yeah, which one? Flask and? Vue. Okay, good. So, I think I will need to keep my cursor on so we don't lose the screen. So, that's good to know. Is there anyone here who is like backend developer? Like, okay, good to know that. Okay, so Angular, we'll talk about it. I got a list of things to talk today. Before talking about the framework, how I came to it. Well, the story, I was in the middle of a React course in 2018, and I was attending a church in Argentina and wanted to make something to get my hands dirty and not get stuck in tutorial hell. So I reached to a guy there, and he was a backend developer, and he said, okay, yeah, let's build a website, a web application. But I know Angular, and I said, okay, I know React. And okay, well, we'll see, and we switched topics a couple of times the same, and in the end, decided to stop learning React. I'm gonna learn Angular and then get the project going. So yeah, that went well. I think he did most of the backend job. I did most of the front-end stuff. But we managed to get a web application. We used a template. So yeah, you see, it's like, yeah, I got a lot of appreciation for this first project, good memories. So I increased some data from the backend, for example, the messages. So yeah, that was a good introduction to Angular. So yeah, and I discovered a few things that I liked. I am gonna talk them a little bit later. Yeah, this quote is like, you need to be open to learn new frameworks. In life, you will stump on a project and it might not use the framework you're used to. You need to be open and say, okay, it might not be my favorite framework. Yeah, you need to be open and learn new ways of doing things, new architecture and all that stuff. So that will help you a lot. For example, at the moment, I'm learning PHP and WordPress. And so yeah, it's like you need to be open to transition, and that helps you a lot to understand better the things that you already learned and the things you already know. So yeah, yeah. So far, I haven't talked about what's the framework and the features and all that stuff. So it's a front-end framework. So it works on the client. And it's got some features like TypeScript out of the box, and you're forced to use it. So if you're not into TypeScript and you need to jump into an Angular project, well, you will need to spend some time getting up to speed on TypeScript. That's one thing, and it uses observables, which are kind of, you know promises, right? Promises can return something at any point in time, and they're done. But these observables can emit things, and they can keep emitting things, and it's like they're like live streams, and then you can listen to it. So you see the reactivity behind it is more complex. So yeah, you will have some kind of you will need to spend time in getting up to speed with it. Yeah, I'm gonna show you one course I used. I think I have it in the yeah. So you see this. Yeah, I'm not earning money by sponsoring this, just to give you a hand. And you can get a discount coupon code if you want. But yeah, this course is from Academine. I found it really useful. I did it, and then I tackled the church project, and it went well. Yeah, really recommend it. All the links there will be shared afterwards, maybe in the meetup group, so you can, don't worry now. So yeah, other things about this this framework. Let me check if I have something else written down here. Well, yeah, I talked about the steep learning curve. It can be used to build web applications and also some mobile applications with Ionic. I don't know if you have heard about it. Ionic is like Ionic framework. You will see. So yeah, with this framework, it's like there's a layer between the web app and to talk to the phone APIs. So check it out. So yeah, it's like quite flexible. Web apps, you can build mobile applications. And yeah, let me check. Oh, it's class-based, sorry. Yeah, if you come from the React world, it's all nowadays functions. So you need to deal with classes as well, which I don't mind, but some people complain about it. So yeah, that's more or less like the idea about how it works, what features has. Well, be careful of AngularJS because you will see, especially on like articles or things like, yeah, why? Yeah, let's choose AngularJS to build your application in 2022. The new version of Angular is called just Angular without the JS part. So if you see articles quoting AngularJS like as a modern framework, just don't read it. So I found like on the internet you can find sometimes not good articles about Angular because if you see the title, it says AngularJS, just you know the content. So you can see that's the angularjs.org, and well, it says try the new Angular. So it's like the 1x version. Yeah, excuse me, I'm gonna have some water. It was born in 2010, but it was created by Google, and it couldn't. I mean, it was great at that time, but they couldn't improve it further without doing a massive rewrite, and they decided to do the rewrite in 2016, and that put people off because imagine you were building your company's software, and then you're told, okay, we are rewriting your framework, you need to migrate, and the migration wasn't easy. So that was 2016, and React came before Angular, so it was 2013. So a lot of people just moved to React because they didn't want to rebuild the project, and what if the company decided to rewrite it again? you're spending time and money. So yeah, that was kind of travel times for the framework. So yeah, here the scaling problem, the rewrite was just to scale better. With the AngularJS code, they were having some like limitations. So yeah, and new features, it put people off, like TypeScript observables, rewrite your whole application. That was kind of tough for people. And then we have new friends here in Angular world. You know components in React, right? You have components, you build your UI of components, you put some logic there as well. But in Angular world, there's a new type of classes called services. I mean, they're classes, but they have special function. I'm gonna do an exercise. So I need, you see this pack of Pringles? This will be data, okay? We can eat the data afterwards. I need some volunteers here, like 4 if you want. Let's make a row, okay? Let's face the camera. It's gonna be easy. You don't need to do it. Just stay there and pass the package. Good, good. Another one. Okay, so Jamie is gonna be the parent component, and you are nested components. So let's make a row and face the camera like this. Yeah, perfect. Good. So you're the child component. Would you ask him for the data? you pass the data one by one. Oh, no, okay. You can skip it. Okay. So data is being passed through inputs in Angular. It's like you do with attributes in React. Okay, like props. So yeah, you just can pass it back again. So you see, it doesn't work fine. It's like prop drilling. You see, like in React, you need to pass data component by component till you reach your nested component with the data from the parent component. But now, I'm a service, okay? Services in Angular, they retrieve data and they share it everywhere in the app. So you want the data, okay? I can freely walk. Perfect. You can give it back to me. Yeah, would you like the data as well? Yes. Thank you. Yeah, you give it back to me. You can even modify it, and then I pass it to you, and then I can pass it back to the parent component, and you can keep it. We can eat it later. Okay. Yeah, cheers. That's the analogy. You see the power of services. They keep data, they deliver it everywhere. Any component can reach to it and change the data, and that data, then if you write the architecture right, all the components will be notified when any component changes that data in the service. So components are listening to changes. They can be subscribed. So yeah, let me check here. Fun time, yeah, we have done that. Services for, yeah. So yeah, it's like managing, you can keep there. You can keep, for example, let's see an example here. This is like a service, okay? This is like called like auth service. It's a TypeScript file. It's got some instruction for Angular framework to tell, hey, Angular, I want you to use this auth service class. Yeah, I want any component in the app to reach it, app wide. There's no restrictions, any level in the component tree. You see, we can keep some property like the user. It can be null at the beginning, then can change to the user data. There are sign up functions, a login function. So any component in the app will be able to reach this data. And the user, when the app is bootstrapped in the browser, this class will be instantiated and an object will be created. And that very same object is reached by any component in the app. That's the power. It's the same object, so it's the same state for everyone. It's not an isolated state for each component. It's the same one app-wide, like a global state. So yeah. And then how is it used? You see, this is a component. Then that class is imported. This is like data that's telling Angular how to deal with this component, which is the header component. And And you see here we can keep like a is authenticated state is a property, a Boolean. And here's the important part. We pass the auth service. Yeah, we pass the auth service class inside the constructor of the class, and Angular will kind of inject that object inside our component. So we will reach in the object, the global object. And then, well, this is like ng on init. It's like when the lifecycle method, when the component starts, we kind of need to subscribe to that user property of the object, and then we can set like a local state in this component, which is authenticated. And then, well, depending on the view, depending on the state, we can change the view. So I got an app here that uses that very same code. So it's this application. You see these three things. Items are the header component, and we see an authenticate item here because the user is not authenticated. So you see that the user data is managed outside the component, but it can be reached by the component and any other component in the application. So yeah, that's more or less like an overview of how services work. There are other use cases, like if you want to log things, yeah, you can create those logging functions inside that object, and then as methods, and then share them. Same for validate user input. You don't want to write the logic for validating user input in each like form component. You want to abstract it and put it somewhere else and then reuse it. That's the idea. So if you want to learn more about it, there's an inside angular.io guide, architecture services. You will see like some examples. There will be some more wording and like more complex things, but at least you know the basics now. You see the power of it. For example, here, logger, that logger class can be a service, and we can reach this log function anywhere. So let me check if I'm missing something here. Yeah, the advantages is modularity. You write one class for each purpose. I want to log something that the class is going to be log, or something logger. So you see the power, and it's less responsibility for components because the data is being kept in services. The logic is in services as well. Just your components, get converted into kind of dummy components. I don't know if you remember React. You have smart components which keep the data, and then the dumb ones. So yeah, it's like splitting responsibilities. That's good. Yeah, I think that's it. I covered most of I wanted to share with you. I hope you didn't get bored and you enjoy the pass the Pringless game. Yeah, that's it. If you have any questions, you can ask me. I will see if I can answer them.
I don't want a mic.
I think on a mic, sorry, yeah.
Wasn't there something about like something that was going to like almost scan and present the information so it was more readable for search engines? Was that not something as well that was going to be discussed? Or
don't know. Like Angular doing something like that?
yeah, maybe I misread like the description of the talk, but
No, I mean, this is a client-side application. If we're talking about SEO, there's one tool you can use to make it like, because it's client-side JavaScript. It's like an empty body, and then the app is bootstrapped, then all the magic happens and you have the view. But you can do something with Scali. I don't know how it's, but yeah, you can pre-render all that HTML at build time, like Jamie said with Next.js. So yeah, you can get all your HTML pages ready and cache them. But yeah, the downside is like you need to have data that doesn't change much. Otherwise, you are serving outdated data to users. But you can even like hydrate, like the same as React. You can, like using a hook, like you can fetch the fresh data from the client side. That won't be a problem. Maybe you will have the first load with the old data, but instantly it will get replaced with the fresh data, so that won't be a problem. So yeah, in terms of SEO, I mean, this one, I've written a tutorial about it, because that was a roadblock I found, because the church app, it was all client side, no HTML pre-render. It wasn't appearing on the Google search. So I had to resort to this Scali stuff. And then, let's see. You see, yeah, I've written this tutorial. So if you're interested in improving your performance of your Angular app in terms of SEO, you can read this tutorial. So yeah, that's a good point, SEO
Yes.
and client-side apps.
Yeah, because I'm about to embark on working on an Angular project, and I've exclusively really used React, and I think the Scali thing's quite cool, and I'm going to propose it to the CTO of the project to say, have you explored SEO, or could we use this potentially?
Yes, and they've got a really good community behind on GitHub. So if you ask him, yeah, ask the creators, you will get an answer in like less than a day.
Yeah,
so that's good support as well, and it's all for free. They they do it because they love it. So yeah, definitely using, but yeah, having in mind that if it's like data that changes a lot, well, it might not be that good, and you need to refresh the data, like get fresh one on the client side and rehydrate. Yeah.
Thank you, Esteban.
Welcome. Any other questions?
I was wondering, you were talking about how a service is available to any component. Are there situations where you would want to restrict that, and can you do that, where you don't want a service to be available to all components?
Yeah, if you have some data that's relevant just to a certain part of the app, yeah, it makes sense just to scope it to that area. And that's why there are like 3 ways to tell Angular. Like you can use like a decorator when declaring service, and then you can choose the place where from this, yeah, it's like you're telling the scope of it. Root level is everywhere. Any component can reach to it. I think it's being discussed here. Yeah, I'm not sure. You see, then I think it tells you the ways to do it. But the best way is use this add injectable, because it has some performance benefits. But yeah, definitely, you don't want to share like app-wise something that's not relevant to it. So yeah, that's a good question.
Cool, thanks. And my last question is, what do you predict is going to happen in terms of Angular versus React? Do you have an opinion? Do you think people are going to be more attracted to Angular now and don't find it as scary in terms of the changes that used to happen to it?
Yeah, I think nowadays, yeah, in terms of market share, a lot of people look at that as well, and how easy it is to hire people as well. And it's not just the technology itself, there are other things around it as well. So yeah, I think nowadays it's easier to find React developers than Angular developers. So if you have a product you want to build, you might want to use React maybe or Next. It depends on your needs. But still, Angular has a like a place in the enterprise world. Like maybe if you have a an enterprise app that's only shared between inside the company. You don't need SEO. You don't need like image optimization. You don't need all that stuff. So maybe you have some backend developers, so they might prefer using classes and all that flavor. So it will depend on the organization and the type of project and what you have in-house as well. Yeah, that's why it still has its market.
Great answer, thank you.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Esteban. Just a little round of applause there. Thank you. Cool. So that is us for Edinburgh.js for this week. Please do catch us on meetup.com, on Twitter for the announcements about the talks for the next one. If you want to do a talk, please do just send us DM. It's not too scary or worrying. We want to be a community group and people sharing their side projects, not just technical talks. So please do get in touch if you want to do that. We'll see you on the 17th of March. Thank you.